The summer of 1952 changed what audiences believed performance could actually be, not through spectacle or technology or narrative surprise, but through one man running headfirst into a wall and making it look like the most naturally funny thing that had ever happened in front of a camera. When Singin' in the Rain reached theaters, audiences came prepared for a good time and left having witnessed something they genuinely hadn't anticipated. A sailor suit, a collapsing studio set, and Donald O'Connor committing his entire body to physical comedy with a completeness that left him unable to rise from bed for several days after filming finished. Most performers would have approached that routine with reasonable caution, marking the more dangerous moments and leaving a margin for self-preservation. Donald approached it like a man who had spent every single year of his life preparing for exactly that kind of moment. Because, in a very literal sense, he had. Born into vaudeville, raised on stages before formal schooling had much of a chance to take hold, and already appearing in movies by the age of 11, Donald never knew a life that existed separately from performance. What audiences saw on screen across decades of film, television, and stage work was never a manufactured image or a carefully controlled persona. It was the genuine product of someone shaped by early grief, physical discipline, and the particular education that only comes from growing up inside show business, rather than entering it as an adult with fresh expectations. The full story of how he built that career, who he chose to build his life alongside, what the work eventually cost his body, and how it finally ended, runs considerably deeper than the grinning face in the sailor suit that became one of Hollywood's most recognizable images. Donald David Dixon. Ronald O'Connor entered the world on August 28, 1925, in Chicago, Illinois. Born into a vaudeville family that treated the road as home and the stage as the primary organizing structure of daily existence. His parents traveled constantly with their act, which meant Donald's childhood didn't include a consistent neighborhood or familiar school hallways. It unfolded in dressing rooms and on trains, in the wings of theaters where he absorbed the mechanics of entertainment before most children had developed any coherent concept of what performance was or why it moved people. Tragedy arrived early, in ways most people are fortunate never to encounter, with several of his siblings dying young, losses that settled into the foundation of his childhood and might have broken a different kind of person entirely. What emerged instead was a boy with a seemingly infinite supply of physical energy, a natural instinct for comedy that required no instruction, and a resilience that would prove to be the most consistent quality of his entire life. By the age of 11, he'd already appeared in his first film, stepping in front of a camera with a composure that most trained adult performers spend years trying to develop through deliberate practice and professional experience. Universal Studios recognized what they had and applied it consistently across the 1930s and 1940s, building Donald into one of their most reliable performers through a steady output of light musicals and comedies that played to everything he did naturally. He appeared alongside names like Bing Crosby and Peggy Ryan, carved out a recognizable identity in musical comedy through his pairings with Gloria Jean and Peggy Ryan, and established himself as a performer whose quick-footed dance style and boyish charm could elevate material that might have felt thin in other hands. The transition from child actor to adult leading man is the specific test that derails most careers in the industry, since the qualities that make young entertainers compelling don't transfer automatically to grown-up stardom, and audience patience for the awkward middle period tends to be short. Donald moved through that transition with a momentum that suggested he'd barely registered the challenge, and the studio system gave him enough repetitions during those years that he'd resolved most of the problems before they became visible to anyone watching. The film that permanently sealed his place in the history of musical cinema arrived in 1952. Singin' in the Rain placed Donald alongside Gene Kelly and a young actress named Debbie Reynolds inside one of MGM's most ambitious productions. a musical that would come to define Hollywood's golden age of dance and song in the collective memory of everyone who has ever cared about either. The film as a whole was already exceptional by any measure, but Donald's contribution in the Make 'em Laugh number developed a life entirely separate from the rest of the picture. The sequence required him to throw himself at walls, execute tumbles across a set that was collapsing around him, transition between physical gags with a speed and precision that demanded extraordinary coordination, and sustain a comedic energy across the entire routine without any visible sign of the enormous physical effort happening underneath. He rested in bed for days, recovering after filming wrapped. For a production already stacked with talented performers working at the peak of their abilities, that single number stood apart, and it has continued to stand apart in every retrospective and analysis of the film in the decades since. The physical commitment required was extraordinary by any professional standard. The result was something that moved beyond the category of great performance and entered the narrower space occupied by things the audience simply cannot be expected to forget. Running parallel to the MGM work was a franchise that gave Donald a completely different identity for a completely different kind of audience. The Francis the Talking Mule series placed him as Peter Sterling, a likable army soldier whose most reliable source of wisdom turned out to be a mule with considerably sharper instincts than most of the humans sharing the frame. Donald admitted in later interviews that his feelings about the series were genuinely complicated, since being identified that closely with talking mule films wasn't the legacy he'd imagined as his career built toward something more prestigious. None of that altered the fact that audiences loved the franchise unreservedly, and its popularity extended his name into households that might never have sought out his more refined musical work. The series kept him visible and working during years when visibility and work are exactly what careers are sustained on, regardless of whether the individual project matches what the performer considers his highest ambition. Television pulled him into its orbit the way it drew most film performers of the 1950s. And Donald moved into the new medium with the same directness he'd brought to every previous format throughout his career. The Donald O'Connor Show established him as a genuine and compelling headliner in a medium that was still discovering its own grammar and figuring out what it could actually accomplish with a performer's full range. His work on the Colgate Comedy Hour earned him an Emmy Award, a recognition that confirmed his instincts translated from theater and film into the living room, without losing anything essential along the way. In 1954, the Primetime Emmy for Best Male Star of a Regular Series placed his name on a record of achievement that stood alongside but distinctly apart from everything his film work had already built. That same year, he hosted the Academy Awards, standing in front of the largest television audience then watching, and demonstrating that natural ease and authority in front of a crowd were never qualities he needed to prepare for or manufacture in the moment. Las Vegas venues invited him. Broadway productions followed. International stages came after that, because Donald O'Connor was never a performer who belonged to one format or one room. And the accumulated evidence of decades made that point more convincingly than any single achievement could have done alone. His personal life carried its own weight running beneath the professional record. At 18 years old in 1944, Donald married Gwendolyn Carter in Tijuana, Mexico, in the kind of impulsive, romantic commitment that the pressures of a rising career in entertainment had always been particularly effective at encouraging in young people. She was 20, 2 years his senior, and together they had a daughter named Donna before the demands of constant work and the distances a demanding career creates between people gradually wore down what they'd started with. The divorce came in 1954, leaving behind the enduring bond of their daughter and the quiet acknowledgement that youth and professional ambition don't always leave room for everything a marriage requires. 2 years after that, on October 11, 1956, Donald married actress Gloria Noble, and that decision became the most consequential one he made outside his professional life. Together they raised 3 more children named Alice, Fred, and Kevin, established a home in Thousand Oaks, California, and remained together for 47 years, all the way through to his death in 2003. Gloria provided the grounding that his earliest years inside a traveling vaudeville family had never offered, and Donald acknowledged that in the way people acknowledge things that matter most, consistently, quietly, and without requiring an audience to make the gratitude feel real. Debbie Reynolds held a permanent and distinct place in Donald's reflections throughout the later years of his life, a name he returned to again and again in interviews with a warmth that never diminished across the decades. During the production of Singin' in the Rain, Reynolds arrived on set without formal dance training and immediately began pushing herself well past exhaustion in rehearsals just to keep pace with Gene Kelly and Donald during preparation for sequences that demanded professional-level skill from everyone involved. She had no dance experience when she started, Donald recalled across multiple interviews, explaining that she worked herself to physical collapse in pursuit of keeping up with two seasoned performers inside a production that was uncompromising in what it asked of its cast. The determination she demonstrated left a mark on him that the passing years couldn't touch. Beyond the stamina, he spoke consistently about her warmth between takes, her humor during the long filming hours, the specific quality she had of lifting the collective mood on a set where the demands were intense and the schedule left little room for anything except work. "Debbie was like family to me," he said in one of his final extended interviews, choosing that word deliberately to describe the bond that forms between people who've experienced the pressures of the entertainment industry together at a moment that turns out to define both of them. His last public reflection on her carried no qualification or hesitation. There would never be another Debbie Reynolds, and he said it the way people say things they know to simply be true. Out to Sea in 1997, alongside Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, demonstrated that his comic instincts had survived every year between the golden age of musical film and the late 1990s without softening or losing their precision. The American Film Institute honored him with a Career Achievement Award in 2003, 1 year before his death, recognizing the complete arc of what he'd contributed across film, television, stage, and the vaudeville tradition that had shaped him before any of those other things existed in his life. He received that recognition with the gratitude of someone who understood clearly what he'd been part of, and who had never once stopped understanding it. His body had been collecting the debt of all those decades of physical performance well before the final accounting arrived. In 1990, Donald underwent quadruple heart bypass surgery, a serious procedure that marked a genuine transition into a more fragile physical chapter, even as his determination to keep working remained unchanged. January of 1999 brought pleural pneumonia severe enough that reports at the time questioned openly whether he would survive. A genuinely dangerous prognosis for a man in his 70s carrying a significant cardiac history. He pulled through again, which might have suggested a pattern of survival that would continue indefinitely. On September 27, 2003, at 78 years old, Donald O'Connor died from complications of heart failure at the Motion Picture and Television Country House and Hospital in Woodland Hills, California, a facility built specifically to care for the people who had given their working lives to the entertainment industry. The location carried its own kind of closure for a man who had lived inside that world since before he could properly define himself outside of it. He'd entered it as a boy growing up in vaudeville dressing rooms, and he left as one of the last living connections to an era of musical film, physical comedy, and television variety that no amount of revival or nostalgia will fully recreate. The kind of performer he embodied, one who would exhaust himself past recovery for a single scene and never once stop to calculate whether the commitment was worth it, belongs to a discipline and a time that closed quietly when he did. What he left behind holds because nothing about it was manufactured, and nothing about it could have been.